Good morning, Dr. Sanjay Sinha.
Hi, good morning. Hi, Dr. Nahid, how are you?
Yeah, fine, sir. How are you?
Fine, good to see you.
So we have arranged in the classroom. There
I
are
just saw
about
that.
10 students are there, and we have given the invitation to the other pediatric surgeons in Telangana and Andhra. Some of them they may join.
Sure, absolutely.
Right.
So,
If you are ready, you can go ahead.
of course, yeah,
You
sure.
can. Whenever you want, we'll give that screen share.
Okay, yeah, sure.
I think it is already given to you.
I think it might already be there. Yeah, sure. I'm just waiting for the dot of 8:30. We're almost there. So, in-person academics have started, Professor Narendra? Oh, you don't have a... Do you have a mic on you? No. Okay.
Audio.
Oh, that's okay. So can I just ask a question before we start? So if we have to take questions, how does that happen?
Senior students.
So is there a mic system? How will it happen?
Yeah. You can ask the question, sir. Senior.
No, I mean, if anybody wants to ask, they'll just come to the mic and ask. Is it?
Yeah.
Just you came. Okay. Fine. Okay, sure. Okay, we'll start off. Great. Well, I hope you can hear me clearly. And I hope you can see the slide. Okay, I'll take that as a yes. It's okay. It's okay. Just raise your hand. I'll see from there. No problem. It's okay. Fine. That's fine. I think you can hear and see. I don't hear you.
A bit louder.
I can hear you now.
A bit louder.
A bit louder?
Yeah.
Okay, I will try. I'm speaking fairly loudly, so I hope that... Is it okay now?
Yeah. We are able to hear you.
Okay, right. So good morning, everybody. Good morning, Professor Narendra, all the other faculty and students, pediatric surgeons. I must thank you for this invitation to speak today. I have been associated with the department at Nilofer, loosely, of course, for many, many years now. And I've been witness to the quality of work that you all are doing, which is really, I am sure, amongst the best in the world, the work that you are doing at your center. And I can see that it really is a very busy center with a huge amount of output. In fact, my is that okay? Yeah. In fact, my association with Professor Narendra goes back many, many years, and he might not even remember it. It's almost 24 years ago. My nephew, he was my cousin sister's son, actually had a large diaphragmatic hernia, and I requested Dr. Narendra to operate. And this is 24 years ago. He's doing well now. He's just joined a job actually after completing his education. So he may not even remember that. But it's a very long association that I've had with Professor Narendra. So the mandate I have today is to speak on urodynamics for the pediatric surgeon. And over the next 60 minutes or so, this is what we are going to plan. So in the first section, we'll discuss a little bit about the basics, the principles, and some issues with regard to quality control. In the second section, we will deal with common storage abnormalities, common voiding abnormalities, and certain artifacts of testing. And in the third section, we'll discuss indications, important conditions, and some errors, pitfalls in interpretation of aerodynamics. Now you must understand that aerodynamics, actually there are two different components to it. One is the technical component and the other is the clinical component. And what we are discussing today is essentially the clinical component. So we would discuss only those aspects of technical components which are relevant to clinical interpretation. Okay? So let's start with the first section, basics, underlying principle, and quality control. So what's the setup of a aerodynamics? This is essentially the setup that you have. You have one tube placed into the bladder through which you measure the bladder pressure. And this by convention is labeled as P vesicle. You have another tube which is placed usually into the rectum, but can also be placed into a colostomy or in a female adult patient into the vagina, which by convention is called P abdomen because it records the abdominal pressure. And then you have a machine subtracted value that you call the detrusor pressure. We have a filling system through which we fill the bladder with fluid, and this is filled at a certain rate. It is almost never possible to fill at physiological rates because that would take too long a time to do the test. So we inevitably have to fill at supraphysiological rates, and we express those rates in milliliters per minute. How do you decide what speed to fill at? Typically, we don't want to fill at more than 10% of the expected capacity of the patient. And finally, you need to use either a single double lumen tube or two single lumen tubes to be placed into the bladder, one for filling and one for the recording of pressure. So this is the basic setup, how the aerodynamics is done. And then if there are children or adults for that matter who have lesions above T6 level, you need to monitor their blood pressure because some of them can develop a catastrophic life-threatening condition called autonomic dysreflexia. So very important, any individual having a lesion above T6, you need to be very careful for symptoms of autonomic dysreflexia and for checking the blood pressure because some of them may not describe symptoms. And if the pressures go very high, they can develop a stroke or even die. So very important to check this. So what are we essentially interested in? We are not really interested in the pressure that is recorded in the bladder or in the abdomen. We are interested in what's the contribution of the bladder to the overall pressure. So in simple terms, let's say if I were to cough or lift a weight or strain, there'll be a rise in my intra-abdominal pressure. And that intra-abdominal pressure is also conducted to the bladder because the bladder is also within the abdominal cavity. So we need a method to remove that influence so that we can only measure what's been contributed by the bladder. And the way we do that is by subtracting the abdominal pressure from the vesical pressure. So whatever pressure is recorded from the bladder, that's the intravesical. That recorded from the abdomen is the P abdomen. We subtract the abdominal from the vesical pressure to get the detrusor pressure. And this, in practical terms, is done in real time by the computer within the aerodynamics machine to give you a trace. So P det, which is by convention the pressure contributed by the bladder, which is not just the detrusor, as you can understand, because there's a connective tissue matrix, a mucosa, submucosa, and so on. But by convention, P det is the contribution of the bladder wall. And this is a derived unit, not a measured unit. What this also tells you is that you can't have a valid change in P det unless you also have a corresponding change in the P vesicle line. And this is important in trying to identify what pressure changes are valid changes and what pressure changes are artifacts. So let's look at one tracing here. One tracing here to try and understand what urodynamics looks like. Now the top line here is P vesicle. The second line, which is in red, is the pressure from the rectum, P abdomen. And the third line here, which is in a greenish blue hue, is the P det, which is a subtracted pressure. That's the channel which tells you flow. This tells you how much volume has flowed, and this tells you how much volume has been filled. And the last line tells you about the EMG sphincter recording. Now on the x-axis, you also have the volume. And so what is happening here is this is the timeline. So the study starts here, and as time progresses, it continues this way. The bladder fills up. This is a real-time recording of pressure, subtracted pressure. And you can see during all of storage, obviously there is no fluid coming out because this child is continent, and hence you don't find any flow here until the child is asked to pass urine. So this part of the curve up to here is the filling cystometry part. That's the point at which this patient has been told to pass urine. This is an important point because sometimes the only way to differentiate between what is a true volitional voiding and what is a phasic contraction is the place at which the patient or child has been told to void. So if this contraction has happened before the permission to void, even if it's happened after filling, it would still be called detrusor overactivity and not a volitional void. And the importance is that if it is an involuntary contraction, even if it's attained after the filling has been stopped, it may not give you an idea about the patient's ability to void if an outlet procedure is done, for instance, in the child. So that's this part of the curve is the voiding pressure flow. Okay, that's the volitional contraction here. That's the flow. Here you can see the sphincteric activity increasing with time. That's the guarding reflex. You can say as the bladder fills up, you may not always see this very well. EMG is not a very reliable part of the curve. And these are surface EMGs over the perineum. So they give a summation of all the electrical activity from the pelvic floor, the sphincter, and especially the anal sphincter, which is much closer than the urethral sphincter and more in bulk also. Now, you can see here that as this patient is told to pass urine, that's the command to void, the first thing that happens is that the sphincter EMG shows a silence. So the sphincter relaxes before the start of the contraction. And then you have a contraction, which is a volitional contraction followed by a flow. And for the sphincter, we are interested not so much in the absolute numbers. We are interested in the change in activity rather than the absolute numbers. So the sphincter should become silent when the patient voids. But as I said, the sphincter EMG is probably the least reliable part of this test. So what's the urodynamics matrix? So the urodynamics matrix consists of bladder and urethra during storage, and then bladder and urethra or outlet function during voiding. And during storage, we look at involuntary contractions, compliance, sensations, capacity. We look at continence. We see for contractility during voiding, did the bladder empty completely? Is the patient obstructed? And if the patient is obstructed, is the outlet coordinated or incoordinated? So these are some of the things we look at. You could look at a few more things, but these are the important things that we look at when we are trying to interpret the urodynamics trace. It's important to remember that urodynamics is not really a test. It's essentially a three-step consult where you see ideally the patient before the test, get all the details, establish what's called the urodynamic question. That means you have a clear question in your mind as to why the test is being done, what you expect to get from it, and then do the urodynamics, and then have another consult with the patient to try and interpret whatever you have found and discuss with the patient and the family. And ideally, that last step of looking at the tracing should happen before the patient leaves the urodynamics suite, because it's easy to repeat a cycle when the patient is still there in the lab. are in place. They will not change their clothes. After it's very easy to again reintroduce all the tubes to do another cycle of testing if there's something that remained after the test was done. The poorly done urodynamics can be misleading and potentially harmful. So it's very important that the test is done properly and interpreted correctly. If not, it's better probably not to have the test at all. So what are some general principles? It should be interactive, the test. You should try and duplicate the patient symptoms. If you have incident, you need to be cautious and interpret. Need to be careful. Is this really clinically, especially if the saline is not at body temperature, can be enough to trigger a phasic contraction. You need real-time interpretation and observation. So somebody who understands that what's going on has to be there. You cannot delegate it to somebody who doesn't understand. So either you are there or you have a surrogate there who understands exactly what's happening. Somebody mic is on. Yeah, thanks. So for instance, if there is staccato voiding, where the voiding, you see the voiding is like they've got sharp peaks and falls. This can be for a very wide variety of reasons. We know it can be because there's dysfunctional void, but it could also be that the child is uncomfortable in the surroundings, or the legs are hanging in the air, or there is pain, or there are 20 people watching the child or the patient and he or she feels too embarrassed to pass. All these things could actually produce the so-called staccato voiding. So you need to be able to interpret this. And sometimes asymptomatic especially in the neurogenic setting. So you can't really, sometimes they can be critically important, especially in patients with severe lower tract dysfunction. These may make the difference between normal kidneys in the long term or abnormality. And you should ideally have some, either the report final before the patient leaves the suite, or you should have it clear in your mind as to what the report is going to be. So as I said, to make sense of a urodynamic trace, the clinical context is important. So let's look at this child standing by the side of the road and passing urine. And you're trying to understand what is happening here. Is it the stress of an impending exam which makes this child go to the side of the road to pass urine? Is it that this child has overactive bladder, can't wait to reach home to pass? Is it just a response to this Nike ad to do it? Is it comradeship with his canine friend who's just emptied his bladder? Is it just normal social behavior? All this is only possible in a urodynamics test if you are there and somebody is able to interpret in real time what's happened. Going back to the same trace, a little bit about quality control before we move to the next section. Now, when you zero the transducers, these should be zeroed to the atmosphere. So when I said we measure pressures in the bladder and the rectum, we are not really measuring the absolute pressures. So it's not like we are measuring the pressure with the reference as zero pressure of a vacuum. The pressures we measure by convention are the difference in pressure from the atmospheric pressure outside. And this conventionally has been measured in terms of a column of standing water, which is a crude method to measure pressure. You could measure in pascals and so on, SI units. We don't do that. We measure in terms of a height of water column. So what would be the equivalent height of water column to indicate the pressure in the bladder or in the abdomen? So hence it's centimeters of water. So that's not a conventional or a SI unit of measurement of pressure. So we always zero to the atmosphere, not to the patient. So when you put your transducers in, then at that time, there's some finite pressure recorded from the abdomen and the vesical transducers. And you ask the patient to cough, and you can see if there's good subtraction, the detrusor pressure should be close to zero, reflecting that the bladder is not contributing much pressure at this point, which is what you would expect in an empty bladder. Now, the resting values which are written here are actually adult values. And the fact is, you don't have any good paper at all internationally for what should be the baseline resting pressures in a child. And this is a part of quality controls. I'm a bit surprised it's not there. So about 3 months back, we decided to actually start the process of trying to standardize this, and we got our ethics committee permission for the study, and we've just launched this from 1st Jan to study the baseline pressures, and hopefully over the next 6 months, we'll recruit enough patients to be able to publish what should be the baseline resting pressure in children. But the initial PDET, that's the pressure contributed from the bladder, should be between 0 and 6. And this is for adults, but it would be perfectly valid for a child too. So you expect the pressures to be very close to 0. Now, that, as we said, is a maturation line. Now, yeah, so the other things we look at is how is the fine trace match? So you can see here, look at this pattern, small changes in the tracing as the pressures are recorded and the bladder is filled. And this is natural because the patient moves around, speaks something, tightens the abdomen a little, and so on. So all those pressures, these are very sensitive transducers, should get recorded, and they should get recorded by both the channels because, as we said, the bladder is an intra-abdominal organ. And so they should subtract. So there should be a fine trace match. You ask the patient to cough roughly once in a minute, and then cough before the starting of voiding and cough at the end of voiding. All this is to make sure that the transducers worked correctly through filling, were working correctly before you ask the child to void, and were working correctly at the end of the void, so that whatever you have recorded during the voiding continues to be a valid recording. And at any point, especially in the beginning, if you find that the pressure subtraction is not good, the PDET is not fine, there's a drift in the pressure lines, it's important to terminate and restart. Because if you have something where you have a situation where one of the channels is not recording correctly, that's like a fatal flaw. You just can't interpret that. So you might as well stop and restart straight away. So what are common abnormalities and what are potential artifacts? So there are essentially 4 abnormalities which you can call the cardinal abnormalities, 2 of storage and 2 of voiding. The first abnormality with storage is detrusor overactivity or detrusor overactivity incontinence if the child is incontinent. Now remember, as you fill the bladder, you expect that the pressure should be low. So all through the filling phase, the bladder is like a soft balloon into which you're trying to blow air. It should be possible to fill the bladder without much rise in pressure. If you get a rise in pressure, this can take one of 2 forms. It could either be a phasic rise and fall, which is detrusor overactivity, and if it's associated with incontinence, detrusor overactivity incontinence, or it could be a progressive rise in pressure, what we would call poor compliance. So let's examine this patient who has frequency, urgency, and urgency incontinence, but no voiding difficulty. That's the urodynamic trace. And you can see straight away during the filling, that's the volume filled up, 120, 140, 160. You can see even as the filling is happening, you can see a rise and a fall. That's classical of detrusor overactivity. So you can see here the early sensations, their phasic contractions, and there's actually a leak happening in this child. So this is detrusor overactivity incontinence. So detrusor overactivity is a phasic rise and fall in pressure during filling. This is not the precise International Continence Society definition. I don't want to burden you with a lot of verbosity here. So I just want you to understand the concepts. Phasic rise and fall in pressure during filling is detrusor overactivity. In contrast, as I said, a progressive rise in pressure is poor compliance. And now look at this trace. You can see there's a progressive rise in the pressure, detrusor pressure, as the bladder is filled up. This is called poor compliance. What is compliance? Compliance is the same compliance that you studied in your physics in high school, change in volume divided by change in pressure. So the volume change per unit change in pressure is the compliance. So poor compliance is a progressive rise in pressure as you fill the bladder. Now for any patient with lower tract abnormality, the storage pressures are absolutely critical. Because in any given 24-hour period, we pass urine maybe 10 minutes. The rest of the 23 hours and 50 minutes, we are actually holding or storing urine. Even if you're obstructed, you may still not develop hydronephrosis or upper tract damage within limits, as compared to someone who has abnormal storage, where poor compliance especially can wreak havoc on the kidneys quite early. So we've had children, for instance, with myelomeningocele or anorectal malformation, where there's been a delay of just, let's say, 2 years. I remember one patient. The child was born, came to us at 2 years, already had established kidney failure. And this is, these children typically will have normal salvageable renal function at birth. So it's really a double disaster for such children who already have a problem with their spine, for instance, and they develop a preventable problem with their kidneys. Really a double disaster. And we continue to see these patients all the time, as you must be seeing too. So the other two abnormalities pertain to voiding. The first is defining what's bladder outlet obstruction. And so look at this girl who's 11 years with voiding difficulty. She has persistent voiding difficulty, concern whether there's associated voiding dysfunction. And you can see here, that's the termination of filling. That's the place where the child has been given the permission to void. And straight away, you can see that there's a very high pressure void with a slow flow. Now, clearly the height of this curve depends on how I've scaled this. Right? And I'm not getting into numbers. In fact, none of the societies give you very precise numbers as to what should be defined as obstruction or underactivity, especially in children. We don't have very good standards for that. But you can look at the tracings and get a reasonable idea as to whether this is a high pressure and a slow flow. And that would be classical of an obstruction. So to give a very common life example, if you're in a room and you're trying to get out of the room and the door is not opening well, it could happen for one of two reasons. Either the door has to be jammed and hence when I'm pushing, it's not opening, or there's a problem with my ability to push. I'm not able to push hard enough. And because of that, the door doesn't open. And you could obviously have a combination of both. So if I've pushed very hard and yet the door is open very slowly, the door has got to be jammed. But if I've not pushed at all, or I've pushed with very weak power and the door didn't open, the odds are the problem is primarily with my ability to push. So here, this is bladder outlet obstruction defined by a high pressure, voiding pressure, and a slow flow during voiding. In contrast, an underactive detrusor or a weak bladder in a child, you can see here with posterior lateral walls having a poor stream. Here you can straight away see that after the permission to void is given, the detrusor contraction that has been generated is very minimal. There's hardly any contraction at all. And there's hardly any flow. There's a lot of abdominal strain. Now you may ask me, what about these contraction pressures? And we'll come to that in a moment to tell you what these are. So this is an underactive detrusor with poor flow. So an underactive detrusor is a situation where there's a low voiding pressure, abnormally low, and a slow flow. It's important that both of these things should be there. So just having low voiding pressure is not enough to define an obstruction. It's like if I lift this pen in my hand and you're trying to check how hard my muscles contracted, you will find that the muscle hardly contracted. That doesn't mean that my muscle is not capable of a contraction, because the moment you put something heavier in my arm and you find that the contraction is more, you put another more heavy weight, it's even more, and so on. Now, clearly, the amount of contraction you can measure from my arm is dependent on how much I have stressed my arm. So if the outlet resistance is very low, the patient or child may void with very good flow, but with apparently no rise in pressure, and that's not an underactive detrusor. So let's look at some artifacts. So this is again the same kind of situation which you saw in the previous slide. That's P vesicle, P abdominal, that's a subtracted P dead. And you can see here as the child tries to pass, there's abdominal straining. And you can see some pressure changes in the P dead line. So are these a contraction? Well, these are not really contraction. Why are they not contraction? You see very sharp rises and falls here. Now remember, detrusor is a smooth muscle. Smooth muscles take time to recruit. You can't have a sudden contraction and relaxation of a smooth muscle. In your laparotomies, you would see the bowel. The bowel peristalsis is again the contraction of a smooth muscle. They take time to recruit. So any sharp changes in pressure has to come from skeletal muscles, can't come from smooth muscles. And this is because the child is straining, the abdominal pressure is producing changes. And because these changes are very rapid, the subtraction is not very perfect. So you're getting subtraction artifacts. Next, look at this one. And you can see here a possible rise in detrusor pressure. Now this rise, as if you remember, I told you any rise in pressure in the pdet line should have a corresponding rise in the P vesicle line, because pdet is essentially a subtraction of abdominal from the vesical pressure. So you can't have a valid change in the pdet line without a corresponding change in P vesicle. So when you don't see the change here, look at P abdomen and you can see a dip here. And this dip is essentially because of a bubble in the rectal channel. That's not a valid change in pdet pressures. Look at this one. Detrusor overactivity. Check the P vesicle line. You don't see corresponding changes there. So that's not detrusor overactivity because you're not seeing contractions here. So then look at the P abdomen line and straight away you can see that there are spontaneous rectal contractions in this patient. And because of that, you're getting changes in the pdet line. So this is an artifact, not detrusor overactivity. You can also see along with that, there's a slight drift in the abdominal pressure. And that drift in the abdominal pressure is reflecting in a gradual rise in the baseline pdet. This is not poor compliance because you can see P vesicle line is holding steady as we fill. But again, this is because of the drift down in the rectal pressure that's happening. Next, look at this. Very poor compliance as you fill the bladder. But you can see the moment you stop filling, the pressure starts falling. It doesn't come down to the baseline, but it falls. So the compliance is reduced, but not to the extent that is suggested by this tracing at the beginning, because this bladder has been filled too fast. So if you fill too fast, the bladder wall is not able to accommodate, and hence the pressure rises abnormally high. But when you stop the filling, you find a drift down in the pressure. And that tells you that this is an error in compliance estimation. You're filling too fast. So I will hold for a few minutes if there are any questions or comments at this point before we go on to the last of the clinical section of our discussion. So any questions, comments from anybody in the audience? I am not getting audio. I'm not sure whether somebody is there at the other end.
Hello, sir.
I can hear it. Yeah, I can. Go ahead.
Sir, what kind of anesthesia do we give for while conducting UDS?
Ordinarily, we don't use so we use a local anesthetic for the urethra, but ordinarily we don't use any other anesthesia at all. Now, I recognize in children sometimes this can be a challenge. Very rarely we ask the anesthetist to give us anesthesia for placing the tubes, in which case it's a short general anesthetic. And then we try and push coming out of anesthesia. Now, in most situations with an experienced technician, it's possible to get the information that you need. Now, you've got a mic and a speaker next to each other. Yeah, if you've got a mic and a speaker facing each other, you'll get feedback somewhere. So in most situations, we can manage without giving any anesthesia. So once in a while we do it, it obviously is much more cumbersome, drastically increases the cost and morbidity, etc. of doing the test. Also, in young children, sometimes it's not possible to get a good voiding phase record. So at the age of 2, 3, 4 years, sometimes you just can't do the voiding phase at all. But in many of those children, you are more interested, as I said, in the storage. And you can combine the rest of your clinical information with what you get from the storage to draw conclusions about what might be the position with the voiding. Okay.
So I have a question. What is the age at which you start doing UDS? Like how young, or what is the basic minimum age that you would want the child to be to do a UDS?
Who's speaking?
Like, can we do it? So Mandakini, sir.
I thought so. I thought I recognized your voice.
Yes.
I can't see you.
Hi.
Good to see you. Hear you.
Sir. Good morning.
Hi, morning. So you need to do the urodynamics as and when required. So let me give you an extreme example. When should you do urodynamics in a child with open spina bifida myelomeningocele? The answer is the moment they've recovered from their surgery.
Okay.
If you're not opting for some reason, let's say at birth.
Mm-hmm.
So for high risk neurogenic bladder, we need to study them as soon as possible. Because as I told you, there are children who come to us even 9 months down the line, they've already developed severe hydronephrosis and renal dysfunction. And sometimes it's not salvageable even at that young age.
Yes, sir.
So as soon as they're stable from their surgical procedure, that's the time.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Hello.
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 Sir, this is Dr. Anjana, sir, first year resident.
Go ahead, Anjana.
So I would like to ask, if the child is constipated, would it make any difference in the study, sir?
Okay, there's again some feedback from somewhere. Okay, so a good question. So if the rectum is you will not be able to get a good recording of pressures. There is a feedback from one of the mics somewhere. Just try and ensure that the mic and the speaker don't face each other. It's like, imagine them as two eyeballs. The eyeballs shouldn't be able to see each other and you'll be fine. Now, if the rectum is full, the pressure recording will not be right. So sometimes with severe constipation, we are just not able to do the test properly. And we need to send them down for an enema to the emergency. They get their rectum evacuated and then they come up. Some units do a routine enema before doing their test. We don't practice that. But there's obviously an impact of the rectum. So the answer is you need to make sure that the rectum is not full of feces that can compromise the test, and you may not be able to achieve the test at all. And not just that, sometimes these children or adults might pass stools into the Euroflow meter. You make them sit on the Euroflow meter and they pass stools. And that's a mess. It's like half an hour wasted, if not more, because you now call the housekeeping, get this child or adult off the urodynamics machine, clean everything, reintroduce tubes, and it's like it sets you back half an hour, 45 minutes. So clearly you don't want that. Yeah.
So this is Dr. Srinivas from Gandhi Hospital, sir.
Right, Dr. Srinivas.
Sir, hello, sir. I have a question, sir. As you were just answering to Dr. Mandakini regarding the time when we can do the urodynamic in a myelomeningocele case. Like, even if the child is less than 1 year, we can do. That's what I could infer from your answer, sir.
Newborns.
Okay, even newborns.
For a myelomeningocele, 1 year is enough. For a high risk myelomeningocele, 1 year is enough for long-term kidney failure and a lifetime of dialysis and transplant.
Okay. Will this act as a baseline for our future? One, and second thing is, even if we get an approximate or a error in this one, it may give us a what we call the plan of management.
I couldn't get the first part that you said. What was the first?
So the first part is, will this study be a baseline for our future studies, urodynamic studies, which we do later in the life of the child?
Yeah, so for high risk neurogenic bladder, so again, remember, we're only talking of high risk right now. And it's important because many of the pediatric conditions are high risk conditions.
Yes.
So in a high risk condition, most guidelines say that you need follow-up urodynamics once in 2 years. And these once in 2 years, how long, none of the guidelines tell you. So should you do it for life? They don't tell you. But what we essentially counsel our patients is that most of them will require once in 2 years, at least until their growth is complete. And if they are then stable, then probably it's fine. So that would be our baseline, you can say, or let's say that would be our usual dictum. But for patients who are doing extremely well, no problem, no red flags at all, we may reduce that frequency and I stop. So I don't keep doing it every 2 years if I don't expect anything. But if the regular recommendation is once in 2 years. And so the first study typically that we do is to establish what are the abnormalities, to classify the risk profile based on their clinical examination, evaluation, and the urodynamics. And that will also determine when I do the next one. So if the first one is grossly abnormal, then we initiate treatment and retest. Because you can't follow a schedule in the beginning for a child who's got a grossly abnormal bladder. Because if you wait, if you do one and then you think that as per my schedule, I'll do my next after 2 years, again, if the treatment we are offering is not adequate, the child may develop failure by that time. And we've had patients, for instance, who are on CIC and they've developed renal failure. And I can give you any number of such examples. So the child has a lower tract dysfunction, is on CIC, has bad storage not addressed. They're doing CIC 7, 8, 10 times in a day because they keep feeling an urge. And despite that 7, 8, 10 times a day, the upper tracts get knocked off. So just the fact that we have placed this child on CIC is not enough. So the first study will determine when you need to do the next study. And clearly study the baseline for the next one. And then if there are any red flags in between, so let's say the child was fine, but now started developing new onset hydronephrosis. That's a red flag. You may need to do a study earlier than 2 years. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello, sir. So good morning, sir. I'm Dr. Sukumar, final year PG, sir. Sir, in a child with UTI, so how many days we have to wait before doing a UDS?
So ordinarily, you don't want to do a urodynamic study within the first 3 weeks. You don't want to do it. The reason why we don't want to do are twofold. One, in any child who's just had a urinary tract infection, there's a possibility that repeating your test before the child has actually recovered may precipitate another crisis for the child. And the other is infection induces temporary changes in bladder function. So you can get diffuse overactivity, storage abnormalities, and so on in a child who has had a recent infection. And those would all be artifacts, or they would be misleading because they're not really true reflections of how the lower tract is. So for these two reasons, you want to defer it by at least 3 weeks. Okay, so any other questions?
This is Dr. Srinivas again, sir.
Hi, tell me.
Yes, sir. Like say we have done a urodynamic study in a newborn, and say he needs some form of medical treatment other than CIC in the form of, say, oxybutyrin or something. Do we start it immediately at that time? So say the child is 1 month.
Absolutely. Yes, yes.
So even less than 6 months, we can go start off the.
Yes, yes. You need to. So if the storage is bad, you have to start treatment. There's really no option.
Oh.
So we are again, I'll re-qualify. We are talking of really high-risk disease. So the two, we'll be coming to a slide on this, but the two high-risk conditions, especially which are common in children in our area, spina bifida and anorectal malformation. So there are actually only 3 conditions which, let's say, the UK NICE guideline or the European guideline lists as high-risk neurogenic bladder. Spina bifida, anorectal malformation, and spinal cord injury. These are 3 high-risk conditions. Now, spinal cord injury is obviously not uncommon in a child. We do get children, especially older children, who had a spinal cord injury and problems. But the first 2 conditions we see with alarming regularity, because our incidence of these 2 conditions is probably higher than the international global incidences. So it's important, as I said, because we see a lot of high-risk disease in children. Right.
Thank you, sir.
Good morning, sir. Dr. Suhasini here from ESI.
Hi, Suhasini. How are you?
Good, sir. Good, sir.
Good.
Sir, really nice to have you speak here, and I'm really thankful to Nilofer for organizing this session. My whole team is here. So greetings to all of us. Sir, a couple of queries I had. Like we said, we are dealing with a lot of MMCs in the newborn period. But unfortunately, in the present market, the smallest catheter I'm able to find is a 7 French catheter. So which is very, very stiff. So I am not sure if I'm not able to find that is the smallest available, because of which I'm not able to do the UDS in a child smaller than 6 months, especially in male children. So we are forced to defer all our, though we treat them as newborn meningomyelocele, we are forced to defer the UDS till after a minimum of 6 months, provided the baby is about 3.54 kg, because the 7 catheter either doesn't go or it might be too traumatic as these are too stiff. So that's that's a reason, but I'm not sure. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, sir, but is a smaller catheter available, or I'm not able to find it?
So you do get smaller double lumen. So Dr. Suhasini is talking about the double lumen catheter, and you do get smaller ones internationally, but we tend to use actually 2 single tubes which are small in caliber. So we use 2 5 French tubes, and 2 5 French tubes together almost invariably go in. But there's another option if that is also not possible, and that is to put a suprapubic needle puncture into the bladder and put an epidural catheter through that into the bladder. And you can use that for recording the pressures, and use a 5 French feeding tube or a 5 or a 4 French tube through the urethra to fill the bladder. So that's another way of being able to record the pressures, and that gives an additional benefit that when the child is voiding, there is no tube in the urethra at all. So it's possible to do it that way. So it is almost invariably possible to do the study if it provided it's required. So obviously you have to check the condition that we just talked about. It's absolutely required. So you do need to check. By whatever method, it's important to check if it's required.
So another query: the rectal catheter, especially in these babies with MMC, with paraparesis or paraplegia, often tends to come out. And as on date, we don't have an inflatable rectal catheter. So is there any other way we could make sure? I mean, most of the time we end up reinserting it, but I really don't know if that kind of affects the readings in any way.
So actually to clarify, the balloon rectal catheters are not, the balloon in the balloon rectal catheter is not meant as a retention device.
Yes.
In fact, the balloon in the balloon rectal catheter has to be underfilled. It should look like what they call as a raisin, kishmish ki tarah. So so you can't use that balloon to retain the catheter. If you do that, then you get an abnormally high recording because of that balloon. So whether you're using a balloon catheter or you're using a feeding tube with a glove stock, in either case, the tube can fall out. And this typically happens in children or adults for that matter, whose anal tone is very lax. And there are methods by which you can try and reduce the odds, but you can't really completely eliminate that possibility. So, fixing it close to the verge, putting it, putting it in such a way that doesn't get entangled.
Reinserting it in the middle of the study shouldn't really affect.
No, so in the middle of the study, it depends at what point you detect it and so on. So if you've detected it promptly, then you can pause the study and you can reinsert. That should be fine. Usually it's fine. So you need to take a call as to how much the study was impacted before you recognized. But it may be possible to salvage at that point. But if you've not recognized it promptly and you're not sure what is the fidelity of the recordings that have happened so far, then you have no option but to restart from the first.
Okay. So is there time for another last question from my side?
No problem.
Sir, another thing, it happens often that the child refuses to void once the filling is done. So most of our studies are done all by the residents only. So they say that we waited enough, and the child refused to void. So they actually take him in that position, basically on the table. So we are only able to get the filling phase, and then we do interpret it for the filling sake. But then what exactly would be the fallacies in this sort of a study? We're only able to record the filling phase.
So there will be any number of situations where you will not be able to get the voiding, especially in children. So clearly, if you're doing a urodynamics in a 6-month-old child, you can't really do a voiding phase. So in some situations, you have to either extrapolate your whatever you have seen from the study, or more importantly, you take the overall picture of this presentation and then take a call regarding the voiding. And sometimes if you're not absolutely certain, and if you feel that allowing the child to void does not endanger the child or the child's kidneys, then it may be reasonable to hold judgment of the voiding and take a decision in the follow-up. So sometimes you do that. So it's really a judgment call in such situations.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. So one more thing, I mean, how much are you waiting after starting anticholinergic? As of now, we are following a 1 year, too much before dynamics after starting anticholinergics in a patient.
It all depends on how bad the bladder was. Ordinarily, I wouldn't wait in a child. We are talking again high risk. In a high risk child, I would not wait. So in the beginning, we would do our first, in patients who've got bad bladders, we would do our first follow-up study when either one of two criteria are met. Either the child is doing well in terms of their clinical presentation, and that includes the CIC diary and so on, or you have reached the ceiling dose of antimuscarinic therapy. So either things are fine.
That was not my question. I'm saying, like, let us see
So
on the
that's what I'm saying. So that's what I'm saying. So you did your first study, you initiated therapy. Now on initiating therapy, now I find the child's CIC diary, history-wise, the parents say that incontinence episodes have gone, you're just emptying 5 times, in between everything is fine. So we seem to have reached the good clinical endpoint. I would retest at that point, is this enough? Or child not okay, we escalated therapy, reached the limits of storage therapy, and the child is still not okay. Again, I would test, do I need to do some other thing now?
Fine.
Okay.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Sir Mandakini, last question, sir. Sir, say we've already put the child on antimuscarinics and we want to get a first UDS scan done. Would you want us, I mean, we would definitely mention that the child is on oxybutynin. Would our interpretation change, or would you want us to stop the oxybutynin for a couple of days or something like that, sir?
Right. So it all depends what's the purpose of the test. So in many situations, I don't want to stop. So all the situations we are talking about right now, these are all situations where we will not stop, because the intention of doing the follow-up study is to see whether the bladder has become safe on medication, because we already know how the bladder is off medication. But where we have a diagnostic dilemma of what is the diagnosis, there it may make sense to stop the medicines and then do the test.
Okay. Like this is for the first time that we are getting the UDS, sir. Like say we have a posterior rectal valve. We've already put him on oxybutynin.
Okay. Right. So it's a bit of a judgment call.
Yes,
so
right.
The problem in starting medication and then doing it is that if the test is normal, you're not sure is it normal because of the medicine, or was it normal to start with? So should I withdraw the medicine now? What do I do?
Yes.
So it may sometimes put you in a dilemma. But in some situations where the child is on medication, having significant incontinence, you know almost for certain that if you stop it, it's going to be worse. It's fine to go ahead and do it on to see what to do next.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Okay, so let's come to the last section of indicating important conditions and errors in interpretation. So let's say look at some of the indications in children, and this is not an exhaustive list. T-third cord, anorectal malformation, spinal injury, sacral agenesis. In non-neurogenic settings, posterior lateral walls, dysfunctional voiding, not all dysfunctional voids, but those in which are high-risk dysfunctional void. Certain forms of voiding dysfunction which are not explained, or refractory storage abnormalities. All these may be settings where you might need to do urodynamics. If the patient is not a high-risk disease, then in general, we would not do invasive tests before non-invasive therapy. So I don't need to do a urodynamics to decide to give a child oxybutynin, for instance. But if the child is not responding, I might want to do a urodynamics to see why and what to do next. What are the high-risk lower tract dysfunction? And this we've actually just discussed over the last few minutes. Open spinal dysraphism, anorectal malformation, and spinal injury are 3 cardinal high-risk symptoms, conditions. So these are high risk by virtue of this condition. You don't need anything else. An ultrasound scan to say it's high risk. You don't need to measure pressures. You don't. Any lower tract dysfunction formation, all these things are possible red flags to suggest that the child needs assessment, or any unrelenting voiding or storage symptoms. So now let's look at 2 or 3 conditions to try and understand a little bit more detail about urodynamics and lower tract problems. And let's look at neurogenic bladder. Now, in neurogenic bladder, the neurological findings are not reliable for predicting the lower tract dysfunction. You can see here, you have situations where the lesion is cervical and yet there's acontractility, which you wouldn't expect, or that the lesion is sacral, but yet you do not always get just acontractility, you can get other things also. So the neurological lesions may give us a guide, but they are not reliable enough to predict and manage the patient. So urodynamics remains a critical and essential component for high-risk neurogenic bladder. So let's look at these two children. Child 1 is 8 years old with neurogenic bladder on CIC, no incontinence, with an end-fill pressure of 30 centimeters. Child 2 is 10 years old, again neurogenic bladder on CIC, no incontinence, end-fill pressure of 50 centimeters. And if I were to ask you which of these two children is safe or unsafe? Now, to understand this issue of safety, you need to look at some more pieces of information. So are both these children safe? Are they both unsafe? Is child 1 safe or is child 2 safe? So let's look at this trace where as the bladder is being filled up, you can see the pressure is rising. So from what we have discussed so far, this is poor compliance. Then at some point, you might find as you're filling, fluid starts leaking by the side of the tube. When that happens, in the absence of a detrusor contraction, we call it the detrusor leak point pressure. And the volume at which it happened is the detrusor leak point volume. To understand whether the bladder is safe, you then need two more pieces of information based on what I just told you. The first additional information is what's the usual CIC volume. And the second is what are the pressures at that volume. So let me now add in a couple of more pieces of information. This child with an end-fill pressure of 30, the pressure crosses 30 at 100 milliliters. So crosses at 30 at 100 milliliters of filling. And this child, it's 9 centimeters, it's gone behind the screen for me. 9 centimeters at 300 crosses, reaches 50 by the time you've filled 500 ml. Okay. So look at these two tracings. This is child 1 in blue and child 2 in red. And now I factor in the other two things. The average CIC volume for this child is 200. The average CIC volume for this child is 250. And you can see that's the 200 ml point and that's the 250 ml point. And it immediately becomes apparent that child 2 is actually absolutely safe, but child 1 is not. So the pattern of pressure rise can make a difference in our decisions regarding whether a child is safe or unsafe. So child 1, despite lower end-fill pressures, is at risk. And child 2, despite higher end-fill pressures, is not really at risk. Now let's take a look at this 17-year-old patient. I think this patient came from Somalia or someplace, had a history of fall from a height 12 years ago with injury to D11L1. And this is the tracing for this child. So you can see here at 17 years, you expect more or less the adult capacity. As we fill, the capacity looks fine, but look at the pressures going so high. And there's this point of dip here. This is just a spontaneous rectal contraction giving an artifact. Again, remember, look at the P vesicle trace and you don't see a corresponding change there, right? Now, take a look at this patient's video. Then you can see here that as we are filling the bladder, that's the bladder. And let me bring it to this point. So look at this point where there is a high pressure contraction. And at the contraction, these pressures are going up to like 80 centimeters of water here. That's the urethra, and see how widely dilated the urethra is. So there's a grossly dilated urethra because of dyssynergia. And this child has detrusor sphincter dyssynergia. You can also see grossly abnormal bladder morphology. And this kind of a trace, this kind of a trace is disastrous for the upper tracts. So very important to recognize if you have this detrusor sphincter dyssynergia and to manage it promptly so that you can avoid damage to the upper tracts. Because otherwise this can knock off, if these patients are not on CIC, they can knock off their kidneys very quickly. So how do we make a diagnosis of DSD? You can make it by sphincter EMG during the urodynamics. You can make it by a micturating cystourethrogram, by video urodynamics, or by urethral pressure profilometry. So all these are potential methods of making a diagnosis. They have their own problems, but it's important to be aware of the condition and to identify and treat it in time to make sure that the upper tracts remain safe. What are the various conditions associated with DSD? Spinal cord injury, especially cervical. If it's cervical, especially high cervical, DSD is almost universal. Multiple sclerosis, a relatively less common condition in a child. Transverse myelitis, open spinal disc raphe, myelomeningocele, up to 50% children will have DSD. And multisystem atrophy, of course, uncommon in a child. So these are some of the conditions where you get DSD. DSD is especially important to discuss because of its association with upper tract damage. Next, let's look at posterior urethral walls. And we know that this bladder abnormality is a key modifiable factor in children PUV. It's a common abnormality, and it may be associated with either persistence of hydronephrosis or the worsening of hydronephrosis in your patient. And remember, when you do get worsening of hydronephrosis, true vesico-urethral junction obstruction is actually exceedingly rare. So in a PUV child, if you are thinking of reimplanting the ureter, please think twice, because the odds are that the ureter is not going to be obstructed. So it's almost invariably a problem related to the lower tract rather than to the upper tract. The clues to a bladder abnormality here are incontinence, persistence or worsening of hydronephrosis or recurrent UTIs. These are three cardinal symptoms, but there may be other things which will point to the fact that this child requires assessment for bladder function. And because it's a key modifiable risk factor, your threshold for getting bladder assessment should be relatively low, because some of these children otherwise go into, as you know, into irreversible renal insufficiency. Most of it is not preventable because it's dysplasia related, but some of it is preventable, or at least the rate at which it happens can be ready management. So let's look at this PUV with new onset CKD. Now, a neonate presents with a poor stream, chronic kidney disease, creatinine of 2.7, undergoes valve fulguration, hydronephrosis, initially advised urodynamics but is lost to follow-up, comes back with a creatinine of 7, catheterized supportive care, creatinine comes down to 1.9. This is the child's current MCUG. So it looks as if it's a bad urethra, and you can see a bad bladder and a diverticulum here, but you always need to compare this with the original anatomy. And what's very obvious here is that the urethral morphology is much better. And this is consistent with the child's ability to pass well. Just to emphasize the point that anatomical changes in the lower tract or upper tract for that matter may persist beyond correction of these structural abnormalities. So just because it looks a little dilated, if this child voids with an excellent flow, this child may not require another fulguration. It's not going to help in any way. But what you can see here is that there's worsening of the bladder morphology. So look at the bladder, look at the diverticulum, and look at the urethra. So you can see the urethral morphology has improved. The bladder morphology has become worse. And this is classical of bladder dysfunction in PUV with adequate fulguration of the walls. And you can see here it's a poorly compliant bladder with detrusor overactivity. And this is, as I said, poor compliance is very bad for the kidneys. And here, it's also important to see that these pressure rises are happening despite the diverticulum, which is kind of a pressure pop-off for these children. Finally, let's look at a patient with bilateral hydrouretronephrosis, because it's important to integrate all our clinical management or judgment, you can say, into how we use the urodynamics. That's essentially the purpose of this section. And you can see here, this is a child with storage symptoms and hydronephrosis. A 15-year-old male with urinary frequency, enuresis, no voiding difficulty, bilateral gross hydrouretronephrosis, creatinine of 1.8, no gastrointestinal neurological problems. That's the X-ray, and that's the MCUG cystogram imaging. You can see a very large bladder here. That's the urodynamics. The urodynamics shows essentially normal storage pressures. And in the MCUG, there was no reflux, no diverticulum. So you know that this pressure, whatever you have seen here, is a valid recording. So the storage pressures are normal. Capacity is good. Child voids with a normal flow. There's a volitional contraction, some amount of abdominal strain, which is okay because, you know, it's essentially an artificial test, and some children will not be, or adults for that matter, are not that comfortable. But essentially a good volitional contraction, normal flow, empty the bladder completely, normal storage. So then what's the problem? Because this child has bilateral hydrourethronephrosis, obviously large bladder and lower symptoms, storage symptoms. Well, the clue lies in this. We asked this child to bring the bladder diary record, and look at this record. This child has produced 8.5 liters in 24 hours. Diabetes insipidus, not identified for years. And with DI, both the the kidneys, the bladder, all are showing consequential changes. And it's astonishing how picked up with conditions related to polyuria after years of being managed with antimuscarinics and so on, and just a simple bladder diary not assessed. So you can see it's very important to integrate the entire clinical problems or the clinical features into your interpretation. Otherwise you get into trouble in trying to interpret only the trace. So what are some of the common errors? Interpreting the urodynamics in isolation, as we just saw. And we'll just look at some clinical clues in the next slide. Confusing capacity with safe storage. Just because a child has good capacity, it's not the same as safe storage. So we just sent a paper which got accepted by the Asian Journal of Urology on augmentation cystoplasty in children stages 3 and 4. And 3 of the children in that series actually had completely normal capacities, absolutely, and but very bad pressures. So the capacity and safe storage are not the same. Failing to obtain both anatomical and functional evaluation, especially when you expect that there's an anatomical abnormality, so you must combine with anatomical or imaging information, which can come either with a standalone MCUG or can come with a video urodynamics. How you do it is beside the point, but needs to be done. If you don't, then you get into problems. Misdiagnosing lower tract abnormalities in patients with functional changes secondary to chronic disuse. So let's say there's a child who has long-term chronic oligoanuria, or the bladder is defunctionalized because of diversion. So in such situations, or the child has severe incontinence. So the bladder has not really been filled for a long period of time, or that somebody's on a long-term catheter for the last 6 months. So you may find poor compliance. That need not necessarily imply that that poor compliance is truly poor compliance. So there are various methods by which you can get around that, by retesting and so on, to try and understand whether it's truly bad bladder, or is it just an artifact picked up because of chronic disuse. And then missing the clues to a lower tract dysfunction. Because as I said, sometimes you have to rely on other things to take a decision whether there's an abnormality in the lower tract, not just on the UDS. So let's look at some of the clues. So presence of lower tract symptoms. So if there's an upper, let's say, so a classical situation where you are looking at clues for lower tract dysfunction is a child with reflux. So a child comes with reflux, you don't know, or you just, would be a part of a basic screening of any child with reflux, unilateral or bilateral, because this is a list you would like to run through to make sure you're not missing a secondary reflux. So are there lower tract symptoms? Is there any clinical indicator of neurological disease? Is there concomitant bowel, bladder, lower lip symptoms? How's the spine and the focused neurological exam? If there's bilateral involvement down to the lower end of the ureter, be cautious. Assume that it's likely to be lower tract unless proven otherwise. Thickened bladder wall within limits. There are issues with bladder wall thickness, but still within limits. Elevated residuals. X-ray spine showing bony abnormalities, a poor stream on a flow test, altered bladder morphology. All these are things which will give us the clue to a lower tract dysfunction in a child in whom you have an established upper tract abnormality like reflux, for instance. Sometimes some other findings may give an important clue. So let's say this child, in an MCG, you find that there's some amount of reflux. This can be a pressure pop-off. So if you have reflux, then storage pressure interpretation becomes more tricky. Very important to make sure you don't miss an abnormality, because they may be very bad bladders, but the pressures may apparently be normal. So some pitfalls in interpreting the pressures, especially the storage pressures, secondary reflux, large bladder diverticuli, and then situations where there's severe incontinence, you just can't fill the bladder adequately. So if you can't fill the bladder adequately because there's leakage happening all the time, you may miss a bladder problem. And there's some maneuvers you can do technically to get around this problem. So all these are important to recognize to make sure that you are not misinterpreting, especially the storage pressures, as I said, because they are really critical in long-term kidney function. So for instance, this child with PUV, where it's apparently this child has a good storage pressure, safe, reasonable capacity, low storage pressures, but there's a large diverticulum. So it's quite possible even the small change in pressure, we may not accept as normal, because with this large diverticulum, you don't expect any rise in pressure. So in such children, you have to be cautious, especially if they have symptoms, and you would like to treat preemptively such children. And then with imaging, there's the issue of MCG. So then look at this child who had a bilateral ureteric reimplant. This was the MCG before the ureteric reimplant was done. And this child continued to have symptoms after the ureteric reimplantation. And that's the follow-up MCG of this child when lower tract symptoms became pronounced and became absolutely obvious, although they were there in a subtle form earlier too, and the hydronephrosis worsened despite the reimplantation. So there's no refluxy now, but you can see that there is an obvious problem with the bladder. But what's not seen in these two images is this. Neither of these two MCGs included a plain film. And you can see here, this child actually has sacral agenesis. So not including the plain film at both of those studies missed the diagnosis, which you would have picked up just with the plain image, or you would have actually picked up in a clinical exam, because it has to be a sequential failure to reimplant a child with sacral agenesis with a bilateral ureteric reimplant, because we missed the lower tract symptoms, we missed the shortened gluteal cleft, we didn't do a plain film, and then we missed subtle abnormalities on the MCG in the bladder before we reimplant. So as they say, if there's a plane crash, you want to see the sequence of events to make sure what all went wrong, because it almost never happens because of one isolated problem. It's usually a systemic failure, and you can see that happen here before the reimplant surgery occurred. So I will leave you with two illustrative mistakes that can happen in addressing the upper and the lower tracts. So the first illustrative mistake is addressing the upper tracts without tackling the bladder. Now, this is a child who presented with bilateral hydronephrosis at 1 year. This child had a creatinine of 1.2, which was already elevated. There was hydroureteronephrosis, and for the next year or so, this child kept getting DJ stentings placed on both sides. And despite the stents placed, the creatinine kept rising, went to 2.4. And you can see that this is an obvious problem with bladder function. So putting the stent might have worsened it, because it enables an even easier conduction of bladder pressures to the upper tract. So not identifying a problem in the lower tract and just stenting this child is a recipe for a disaster. The second illustrative mistake, addressing the outlet without tackling the bladder. And you can see here a 5-year-old child with voiding difficulty and incontinence, a normal eGFR with moderate hydronephrosis to start with, had multiple procedures, at the end of which he had a Mitrofanoff done. And this is the MCG when the child came. This is 2 years later. The child has a creatinine now of 2.5, a Mitrofanoff done. And obviously Mitrofanoff will not happen at a small run-of-the-mill center. But a Mitrofanoff was done without addressing storage. So we have established a method to address the outlet so that the child can catheterize through the Mitrofanoff without correcting the abnormality with storage. And at a creatinine of 2.5 and such a low eGFR, now it's really difficult to manage this patient because your hands get tied in terms of even augmenting and so on. And this child looks at a poor long-term future. So I will stop at that. I recognize there's a whole lot that we could discuss more, but it's already 9:40. So we will just have a few questions and comments, and I look forward to hearing from you. Sir. I lost the audio.
Video urodynamics.
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
This is Dr. Sukma, sir, final year PG, sir. So what are the indications of video urodynamics?
Oh, so all the situations which we discussed about requiring imaging, and almost every pediatric condition requires imaging. So I would say that most of the situations where you require a urodynamics in a child is also an indication for video studies. Or is an indication for intuitively combining with an MCG. So you can get, I would say, most of the information that you need by combining with an MCG. So as long as you are alert with it, and especially if it's done as a cine MCG, where you're looking at the voiding phase and the storage in reasonable sections on a video, not just on static images, or somebody who understands is looking at it as it happens, you can get most of the information. But in general, almost all the pediatric lower tract dysfunction problems are actually indications for video aerodynamics. So in general, if there is any upper tract dilatation, any suspicion of neurogenic dysfunction, these would be additional indications. But as I said, most of the pediatric issues that we deal with almost invariably require some imaging to be done along with them.
So this is Dr. Srinivas from Gandhi Hospital, sir.
Go ahead, Srinivas. Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. I just wanted to know what are the indications of urodynamics in a case of PUV, and if we are doing, when do we do it, sir?
So as I said, the three cardinal symptoms are, or indications, you can say, clues to a lower tract dysfunction are worsening of hydronephrosis, incontinence, and recurrent infections. So these have been classically shown as predictors for lower tract dysfunction. But there may be so many other subtle things in your presentation. So if a child in any way is not doing well, other than these three things also, because this is one of the preventable things which can impact kidney function, have a low threshold for assessing. As to when to assess, so we want to assess immediately after interventions, because we know after relieving bladder outlet obstruction in any form, storage abnormalities tend to improve, both in adults and children. So if there is, let's say, a poorly compliant bladder, there's detrusor overactivity, and there's a bladder outlet obstruction, if you relieve the obstruction over the next few weeks to months, we expect there will be improvement in storage. So we don't want to immediately assess the bladder after intervention. So although I can't give you a very specific timeline, but over the next few months after intervention, if you don't find the anticipated course of events in terms of regression of upper tract dilatation, in terms of symptoms and so on, then I would be on guard as to whether there is now a need for lower tract assessment. And some of these children, as you know, also have polyuria because of concentration defects and all. So you want to address all those issues. As I said, always evaluate the patient in totality. But if we find that beyond a few months, the child's improvement is not along the expected course, they still have, let's say, incontinence episodes, dribbling, they have upper tract dilatation, which has either worsened or new onset developed, renal function has not improved along the anticipated course. All those kind of situations, I would have a low threshold in addition to those three classical indications I told you for checking bladder function.
Thank you.
Sir, in non-neurogenic indications of urodynamics, what is the difference between dysfunctional voiding and voiding dysfunction, sir?
Right. So when I use the term voiding dysfunction, I'm using it as a generic term to describe any patient who has problem with the voiding phase of micturition. So you could say voiding dysfunction, storage dysfunction. When I'm talking dysfunctional voiding, this is a very specific term given to a situation where the bladder outlet, specifically the striated sphincter and the pelvic floor, they don't relax when the person passes urine. So there's an incoordination with the striated sphincter pelvic floor in the absence of a documented neurological condition. And most such patients are expected to have a staccato kind of a flow. Now, the ICS definition does not give allowance for a situation where you do not get staccato flow, where you do not find a neurological problem, and yet the outlet is dyssynergic. And this is something that we actually wrote and published in 2011 in a review on dysfunctional void. So, but the classical definition, to answer your question, for dysfunctional void is where there is bladder outlet obstruction because of a dyssynergic pelvic floor striated sphincter in the absence of a neurological condition, typically with staccato voiding. So dysfunctional void is a very specific term for one particular form of voiding dysfunction, and a generic label of Voiding dysfunction as a global umbrella for all the Voiding abnormalities which are not structural. So I wouldn't put a stricture urethra, for instance, in Voiding dysfunction. So if you are done, yeah, Sahasini, go ahead.
Sir, so as per the one of the slides you I think showed towards the end, there was a child with bilateral PUJ obstruction where the bladder was missed. So would you recommend that any hydronephrosis, the complete screening would involve a urodynamics, even a unilateral or a bilateral?
No. So that child actually didn't have PUJ obstruction at all, got actually stented on a presumption of PUJ obstruction, I presume. I'm not sure why they did, but that child had ureteric dilatation. And there were obvious problems with the morphology of the bladder, and there were symptoms. So there were so many clues. So as I said, usually such problems happen not because of any one small thing. It's because we are not diligent at every step. And where there are situations where we can't take a decision based on the initial assessment, and the onus is upon us to re-examine our decisions early on. So let's say we have some situation where you've stented, you would certainly not re-stent after 3 months without re-examining what the issue is. Why is the child not doing better? Why is the creatinine still rising? What's the bladder morphology? So the longer you are continuing with such kind of managements, more is the responsibility to make sure that we don't miss something. So it wasn't a bilateral PUJ obstruction at all. It was a misdiagnosis of an obstruction, and the child got stented for something which is actually related to the lower tract.
Sir, another one, is there anything short of a video urodynamics to kind of overcome this fallacious reports because of a high grade reflux? I do understand because...
No, yes, absolutely. MCG.
Okay.
A good quality MCG. So as I said, you can get, I would say 95% of the work can be done as long as you recognize the need. The problem doesn't happen because we don't have it. The problem happens because we fail to recognize the need for imaging. So if you image with a good quality MCG, you'll get almost all the information. I'd say
what I would say is, like, you do know that the child has a high grade VUR, but you still want to evaluate the bladder in this child, and you do not have the video like urodynamics.
Yes.
So is that...
So even with the video, you can't. It's not let's say very easy to decide. Okay, the reflux has started at this precise point, and how much is the pressure at that. Really, what you need to know is there a reflux? Does it look like a high volume reflux, and how are the pressures? So in a child, grossly speaking, if there's a high volume reflux, I would not accept any rises in storage pressure during filling, provided the filling is done at a suitably slow rate. You're not filled too fast, and especially if there are symptoms to correlate. So while I can't give you an absolute rule or regulation with it, but I would be disinclined to accept some rise in pressure in a large volume reflux as an acceptable rise in pressure, as I would in another child who didn't have reflux. So you just need to remember that it's there and factor it in your mind when you're taking your decisions. So you can, in most situations, you can get your answer. In many of the situations of DST with the EMG, you can get an answer. In some situations, when you do the MCUG, you can see actually that the posterior urethra is dilated. Obviously, when you do a video, you get real-time information. But I would say, if for somebody experienced in managing lower tract problems like you, for instance, for years you've been doing this, combining with an MCUG is a very good method, which we've also used all these years.
Yes. So one more thing, there are fortunately rare situations where we have seen that the urodynamics probably done once or twice with a 6 to 12 month gap is fairly normal. But on cystoscopy we do a cystoscopy prior to any reimplant, we still find the bladder is really, really bad. These don't correlate. Then most of the time I go, because cystoscopy is more objective, I tend to rely more on the cystoscopy findings than on the UDS findings. But I mean, what would your take be on that, sir?
So anatomical changes may lag behind in improvement compared to functional changes, and anatomical changes may sometimes persist through life. So very often the anatomy is not completely reliable, and this is true even in adults. For instance, let's say if you're trying to make a diagnosis of whether a patient is obstructed or not obstructed, cystoscopy has been shown to be a poor tool to decide on somebody's obstruction or not obstruction. on the basis of the appearance. So I would say that obviously the anatomical information in some situations is very important, and no denying that. But I would be careful about taking a decision to do something, a surgical procedure, just because the cystoscopy showed me something.
Okay. Like if the cystoscopy findings are bad, we tend to wait before we reimplant. So rather than just say because the urodynamics is looking normal, but the cystoscopy shows that the bladder is...
So let me go. Okay, so let me go into more specifics now. So if there is a bad bladder, ordinarily you should not need to reimplant.
Yes, yes.
So for a secondary reflux, really there is there can be some argument on this. I will accept that there are differing points of view. But in over 125 augmentations for neurogenic dysfunction, we have not reimplanted a single ureter. Okay. And I have never had to go back and reimplant. So, and invariably infections drastically come down, upper tract dilatation tends to settle and so on. So secondary reflux only requires the management of the primary cause, not of the reflux. So now if we have changes in the bladder, it begs the question, why would we be considering to reimplant? So if there is a primary reflux, I don't expect changes in the bladder. And if there is a secondary reflux, then the management from my side would essentially be managing the bladder rather than reimplanting. So as I said, I wouldn't usually take a decision to do such surgical procedures based on the cystoscopy, but I understand that there's more than one way to manage the patient. There's more than one point of view, and none of these points of view or decision makings are right or wrong. It's just the way that, you know, probably we train or we have managed our patients and we feel our patients do well.
Thank you, sir. It was a pleasure discussing, and I think we should do it more often at your convenience. And thanks once again to the Nilofer team for organizing this.
Thanks, Dr. Sahasri.
Sir, this is Dr. Srinivas. Sir, one last comment on a funny note. What we are missing today, because this is on a virtual note, is the chocolates which Dr. Sanjay usually uses junior colleagues.
I know.
Someday we will come and collect it from
absolutely.
you.
I've almost forgotten about the chocolates in all these years. Yeah. Thank you so much.
I remember you just throwing the chocolates at the residents if they answer correctly. So nice of you. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you so much for being patient. I must thank Professor Narendra for giving me this opportunity, and all of you for being there for this program and being so interactive and asking so many questions. It's always a pleasure, absolute pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much, Professor Narendra.
Hello, sir. Sir, I would conclude this session with a vote of thanks. On behalf of Pediatric Surgery in Nilofer Hospital, I thank you for making time on a beautiful weekend morning for enlightening us on this enormous yet very important topic. This class has definitely been an eye-opener to all the postgraduates into urodynamics. As this topic was always dealt with, it was a nightmare for all of us. Henceforth, it will not. Hoping for many more learning sessions with you, sir. Thanks again. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, Dr. Manda. Bye. Bye, everybody. Have a great day.